The Imperium of Man is often accused of being ineffective as a government and a nation, usually justifiably. Having said that though, I think there's plenty of things that it does genuinely well, even comparing it to other factions both in the setting and in other works of fiction. Hell, it even does a lot of things better when compared to the real world. So in this video, let's go over some of the things that the Imperium of Man does genuinely well. We can maybe compare them to some other examples as we go. So first of all, let's dive straight in with the most obvious thing the Imperium does best: war. Well, this one's pretty obvious. Sure, you know Willie Warhammer, the Turkish lad? He's James Workshop's son. Now, James, he's English, I'm sorry to say, but we won't hold that against him more than we need to. Willie, he might be a fascist, he possibly is, and if you're worried he might be, I think that's bad enough. But James, at least James makes fun of Maggie Thatcher, so that's good, that has to count for something. Look, it's in the name, Warhammer. It's the thing the Imperium probably does best, and everything else about it, pretty much, is done to support its war effort. From the humble planetary defence forces and the Astra Militarum, right up to the Adeptus Custodes and the mighty Titan legions, there are plenty of Imperial forces to talk about. Even when just talking about the Imperial Guard, there are so many different ways in which the Imperium excels. For example, they have an entire world called Catachan. I think that's how you pronounce it properly. I'm going to get a bunch of names wrong. This planet's main export is its people, its soldiers. While there are plenty of other planets whose main export is also its soldiers, Catachan is a little different. The world itself is a death world. It's covered in some of the densest and most dangerous jungles in the whole galaxy. One of the greatest ambitions for pretty much anyone born there is to join the Imperial Guard and leave. When they do, they are highly prized as some of the greatest fighters in the galaxy. Essentially, they are written as an army comprised entirely of Rambos. That's how they're depicted in their artwork, and that's how they're written. Individual members of the Catachan regiments are the equivalent of whole teams of regular human soldiers. When they're put in hostile natural environments, they are able to both thrive and deal with threats that would put other forces in serious jeopardy. They are considered a huge asset to the Imperium. They also, realistically, probably wouldn't exist as a force under any other kind of government. Yes, they were able to defend their homeworld against invasions. They can liberate themselves and ensure that nobody else will be able to live on Catachan itself, but realistically the soldiers from that world will never really be able to project their prowess on battlefields further from home without help from the wider Imperium. It's pretty typical of Games Workshop and 40k in general. They created an entire culture around a popular series of movies from the 1980s. But they've done something similar with plenty of other Imperial Guard regiments. The Death Corps of Krieg, for example, they're very popular among the fan base. They're based on a combination of French and German soldiers from the First World War. They are masters of siegecraft, and their forces consist of huge numbers of highly motivated and trained individuals who seem eager to sacrifice their lives for the Imperium. There's a high possibility that they use less than approved of cloning technology to increase their numbers and ensure that they will always have enough soldiers to fight in protracted sieges throughout the galaxy. Thousands of years before the current setting, Krieg was engulfed in a civil war. There, the Imperial forces just barely won out against separatist rebels. This heritage has motivated the population into becoming fanatically devoted to the Emperor and his Imperium. There are millions of soldiers from Krieg who are not only willing to, but eager to die for the Imperium and to atone for the perceived sins of their ancestors. There are a few examples of people actually able to overcome their survival instinct. Yet there are some extremists, kamikazes and the like, who are able to do this. They are so notable in the real world because they're so rare. I don't know this for sure, but I feel pretty confident in saying that in reality, it would be impossible to get millions of people willing to leave their homes and sacrifice their lives in an alien environment for an emperor they are definitely never going to meet. I also feel pretty confident in saying that you shouldn't do this if you have the option to. But to their credit, the Imperium have actually managed to do it. Then we get to the super soldiers. The Imperium has access to plenty of different kinds of super genetically modified enhanced warriors clad in armor to the extent that they are functionally living, breathing, thinking tanks. Obviously, there's the Space Marines. They're the poster boys of the setting, and their numbers are supposedly less than 1 for each of the million worlds of the Imperium, but that is more than enough for the job at hand. They are divided into about 1,000 different chapters of about 1,000 Marines each. These numbers do differ from chapter to chapter. It's purposely kept vague. They are basically the Imperium's special forces. When they gather at scale, and there are multiple chapters or legions in the case of the Emperor's Great Crusade at the foundation of the Imperium, there is really nothing that can stand in their way. While some of that does come down to plot armor, the fact remains that each Space Marine is a force multiplier and is capable of having battles and military actions hinge around them. I'm just going to go on a little bit of a tangent here about the numbers and the scale. Games Workshop famously doesn't do scale well. Having 1,000,000 Space Marines sounds great, but in a galaxy as big as the Milky Way, it really means nothing. It's just the fact that this was a setting designed to sell miniatures. Having chapters of 1,000 Marines is something that a really dedicated, obsessive, and rich, or maybe just terrible with their money, collector would be able to achieve. I know it's been said by plenty of other people before, but even if you just added an extra 0 to most of the numbers that Games Workshop use when describing the Imperium, I think it would be a lot better. The Space Marines, though, they're probably the most famous of all the different military branches of the Imperium, but there are plenty of other settings that have similar super soldiers. One thing that is a little more unique to the Imperium, though, are the Adeptus Custodes. They are the Emperor's personal bodyguards, some of his earliest genetically enhanced creations. This force of 10,000 is more capable on an individual basis than almost any other faction in the galaxy. The Adeptus Custodes are the Emperor's Praetorian Guard. However, unlike the historical group, these forces are completely loyal to the Emperor. They are taken as children from the families of the Terran nobility. Then, they're genetically engineered to be far superior than even the mighty Space Marines. They are clad in golden armor so expensive that it's said each suit costs as much as the output of entire worlds. They were created not just to protect the Emperor, but also to be his companions. They are scholars, philosophers, and are well versed in many different pursuits. So not only are they able to defend themselves and the Emperor, but they are able to engage with him in conversation on any number of different topics. It's hard to find any other examples in fiction of a force this elite. Even in the real world, the Praetorian Guard who defended the Roman emperors were known for their love of changing said emperors, sometimes violently. They were nowhere near as loyal to their charge as the Adeptus Custodes are. This brings us to another one of the most impressive things about the Imperium of Man: its stability. The Roman Empire collapsed over a long period of time, for a bunch of different reasons, one of which was the constant changing of rulers, in part caused by the Praetorian Guard assassinating different emperors, causing political instability. The Roman Empire lasted for a little over 2,200 years, first as a small city-state kingdom on the Italian peninsula. Then, after about 200 years, it became an expansive republic. 500 years later, it became the famous Roman Empire that we all know and love. And after the sack of Rome, another 500 years later, in 476, the Eastern or Byzantine Empire kept the Roman culture alive for another 1,200 or so years, before its capital of Constantinople was conquered by the Ottomans in 1453. That's a huge length of time, especially when compared to modern states like the US, which has only lasted about a tenth as long. Yet even though Rome lasted 2 millennia, there are states that did far better still. Japan has been around in some form for about 2,600 years, and China has existed in one capacity or another for about 4,000. Ancient Egypt got about 3,000 years, and the Egyptian culture and society is still there, though much changed, on the banks of the River Nile today. The Imperium of Man beats them all. It lasted for over 10,000 years. Think of all the changes and upheavals that have occurred in the last 10 millennia here on Earth. It's so hard to get any sort of political entity going in the first place, let alone keep an actual and functioning state around for more than a few generations. The Imperium has been going, and very much looking the same way, for about as long as there have been settled communities on Earth. The Imperium is one of the most stable cultures in fiction. It's lasted virtually unchanged for millennia. There have been invasions and upheavals, yes, but none of them have yet managed to undo the Emperor's work during the Great Crusade. Having said all that, it is worth mentioning the difference between culture and state. The Imperium is a very diverse place, and there are plenty of worlds, that have cultures and traditions that predate the Emperor's arrival. Even though the Imperium has been far more stable than any government in human history, with a history of its own far longer than anyone can really comprehend, there are actual real-world groups that have been going for longer than the Imperium has. There is evidence that certain cultures on present-day Earth are actually far older than the Imperium of Man is in the setting. The Ainu, again I think I'm pronouncing that right, but I don't know, they are indigenous people to Russia and Japan. They're almost extinct, but they've been seeing a resurgence in recent years, but they've been around for 15 millennia. In southern Africa, the San peoples, sometimes known as Bushmen, they've been hunting and gathering and using their unique clicking language for about 20,000 years. But probably the oldest culture that we know about are Aboriginal Australians. There are some estimates that date their culture back around 65,000 years, and it's remained the same culture pretty much that whole time. While the Imperium definitely has some catching up to do with the likes of these, the fact remains it has managed to last on scales of time, territory, and teeming masses of people that is impressive in its own setting and completely unprecedented in our world for any organised state. But what makes the Imperium so stable? The main reason is definitely the Emperor. He is the immortal leader, the dictator basically of mankind. He is literally kept alive by the sacrifice of thousands of souls every day. He is also protected by some of the strongest armies in the whole galaxy and is worshipped as a literal god by the majority of his subjects. The scale of this system of authoritarianism has just been built up so much over such a long time that there is really no other way of existing for countless billions of people. One of the main reasons why the Imperium is so good on these timescales is definitely in its messaging. In this galaxy-spanning empire, there are people on completely different worlds with wholly separate cultures, climates, lifestyles, and languages that are still subjects. In the real world, even the countries with the most infamous propaganda systems have struggled to maintain control of the public's hearts and minds. People in Germany knew the Second World War was going badly for them, despite what their government was saying. In the 1980s, Soviet citizens were well aware that many different parts of their state apparatus were not working. The United States was never able to win over people in countries like Vietnam, Iraq, or Afghanistan, despite any number of military successes or the promise of a higher quality of life. Even the mighty British Empire was unable to change the identity of the people in places as close to the imperial core as Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. In spite of centuries of religious, linguistic, and cultural dominance, these other identities still exist today. The Imperium, on the other hand, actually manages to incorporate many different and disparate groups and factions into its fold. During the Great Crusade, alongside the armies of super soldiers, were the forces of iterators. These were artists of various different types, like poets, painters, photographers, and countless more. Some of these individuals became crucial to early imperial history and the foundations of organizations like the imperial cult. But one of the things they all collectively managed to create was the notion of an imperial identity. They helped to sway the people of a million different worlds into believing they are a part of a much wider community and are a fully connected part of it. Imperial propaganda is ubiquitous. There are citizens living in desperate conditions beneath towering hive spires, serfs toiling away on fields in conditions similar to medieval European peasants, and the ratings press-ganged into labouring on one of any number of countless ships of imperial fleets, all of whom will celebrate feast days like Sanguinalia and worship the Emperor, usually as the divine saviour of mankind from all the terrors of the universe that are out to destroy the species. The Imperium excels in its propaganda more than almost any other group. You could well imagine that before the Great Crusade, in a previous life with a previous identity, the Emperor of mankind might have been an ad executive on Madison Avenue in New York. That's my headcanon anyway. The Emperor was Don Draper. While we all love the Imperium, there's one thing we have to realise about it. It is a totalitarian, evil nightmare of a place that wants to subsume everything and everyone in the galaxy. Unlike other empires in history, though, this one might actually do it. There's something that almost every single empire or conquering power struggles with. It doesn't matter when in history, every nation that tries to exert influence over anyone else against their will seems to have trouble repressing people. First of all, let's just get this out of the way. You shouldn't do this. But I'm not really here to judge anyone. least of all the Imperium of Man. This is a listicle of all things the Imperium does well, after all. Repressing people is actually a hard thing to do. It's something that people tend not to like being on the receiving end of, and so will tend to fight back against it to varying degrees of success. But interestingly enough, it's also something that people tend to not like doing to others. There are all sorts of stories in warfare of people actively trying not to shoot enemy combatants. Army leaders in many different conflicts have consistently found that making sure their soldiers try to kill their enemy is actually really difficult. Even when it comes to things like repressing groups of people over a sustained period of time without any real conflict, things get tricky. People don't generally like to treat others badly, or at the very least, they don't like to think that they're treating others badly. Usually when governments or others repress groups over a sustained period, they wind up treating the repressed people as less than human, and considering them as less than human too. The Imperium somehow manages to not only repress whole planetary populations for millennia at a time, but they fully recognize the people that they are repressing are human while they're doing it. Due to the internal logic of the imperial government, they seem to constantly find themselves in situations where the destruction and subjugation of huge numbers of people is actually considered to be the best option. And they do it. They constantly wind up destroying whole planets to stop alien and demonic invasions, keeping whole communities locked into intergenerational servitude through working in factories or in different military institutions. That's the norm in large parts of the Imperium. Some of the main characters in different 40k novels are Inquisitors, like Eisenhorn. They are on the supposed good side of the moral compass in the galaxy, but they put the protection of the Imperium as a state on the same level as the protection of humanity as a whole. That means that if a whole community has to die in order to stop a threat to the wider Imperium, it absolutely has to go. It's real basic trolley problem stuff. It's the kind of philosophy that seems really deep if you've never come across anything like it before, or if you have some sort of antisocial psychological disorder. So just the kind of person who would be an inquisitor or an imperial governor. The trolley problem is not a hypothetical for the Imperium's leadership. The average imperial leader faces it 10 times a day. The Imperium might not be known as the most efficient organization, but their industry is still a force to be reckoned with in and of itself. Imperial industry is largely based around the organization known as the Adeptus Mechanicus. This is a sort of sister empire within the Imperium itself. Its capital is the planet Mars, and it's an organization that worships technology and knowledge as the central tenet of its faith. There are plenty of reasons as to why the Mechanicus is one of the biggest negatives about the Imperium. They have a virtual monopoly on pretty much any advanced technology and production. If you want to create an advanced spacecraft, a Titan, or any other of the Imperium's best equipment, you really need a buy-in from the Mechanicus. They are loath to give away any of their precious knowledge and secret it away as much as possible from the rest of the galaxy. They see machines as sacred, and things like science and progress are considered heretical in their minds. However, in their belief that machines are sacred, they will also go out of their way to use them for their intended purpose as much as possible. That means their forge worlds are exactly that, entire planets dedicated to the purpose of production. Some of these worlds are famed for certain products or industries, but for the most part, each forge world is capable of creating the goods needed to supply whole regions of space. If the Imperial Guard need a few million rifles, no problem. The Imperial Navy needs starfighters and ships, that shouldn't be an issue either. Their shipyards are capable of producing multiple city-sized vessels at any given time. Even on less developed industrial worlds that are not run by the Mechanicus, Imperial foundries are able to produce huge amounts of stuff. But none of this industry would matter without what we'll talk about in the next section. Okay. So we saved the best one for last. This is what you are all looking forward to. This is the thing the Imperium does, I think, about as well as warfare. Sometimes it might even do this better than warfare. It's something that all of us have an interaction with every day in the real world. Businesses, empires, communities, societies, and civilizations have all risen and fallen on this one issue. Of course, I am talking about logistics. The current de facto leader of the Imperium is the Primarch Rebute Gilliman of the Ultramarines Legion and chapter of Space Marines. It's well known at this point among the community that each of the Primarchs has some sort of a speciality, and in some cases even superpowers. Vulcan of the Salamanders is a perpetual. He can never die. Conrad Kurz of the Night Lord's Legion, has the power of foresight and can essentially see the future. Corvus Corax of the Raven Guard was even able to turn himself functionally invisible. Some Primarchs had powers and abilities that weren't quite as impressive, like Rogel Dorn, whose power seems to have been that he was able to create defensive structures and participate in defensive warfare better than anyone else. And Mortarion of the Death Guard, he was able to endure more pain and punishment than almost anyone else. On the face of it, that might sound great, but at the end of the day, he still had to go through all of that pain and torment in the first place. Guilliman, on the other hand, has a command of logistics like nobody else. Before he reunited with his father, the Emperor, and the Imperium at large, he had created a pocket empire of 500 worlds surrounding his homeworld of Macragge. After his reawakening in the current time of the setting, he made his way back to the capital of the Imperium and has been able to organise crusade fleets the likes of which have not been seen since the glory days of the Great Crusade. It might not seem like much of a power at first glance, but really this is one of the things that the Imperium as a whole is actually really good at. If we look at our own world, logistics play a huge role in all of our lives. The products, the food, the medicine that we interact with and use on a daily basis, sometimes as a matter of fundamental survival, often comes from places that we will never see. A lot of our globalized systems are based around huge multinational businesses. Many of them use things like just-in-time shipping. Initially created by Japanese car manufacturers, this supply chain system is an integral part of the world economy. As successful as it is, however, it's far from perfect. We all saw huge disruptions to this supply chain during the pandemic. The most famous example was when that ship, the Ever Given, blocked the Suez Canal, which had a huge negative impact on world trade. Whole communities, economies, and in some places countries were disrupted because one vehicle got stuck in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Imperium, however, works on a whole different scale. Many of its worlds, like Terra, are incapable of sustaining their populations. They need to have things like food, drinking water, and sometimes even air imported regularly, or their populations will suffer and maybe even die. After the opening of the Great Rift, there was a huge disruption to interstellar trade. This caused massive famines on Earth and plenty of other places throughout the galaxy. While I know that this shows that there are flaws, obvious flaws and problems with the Imperium's system of logistics, I think it also shows how successful it is in the first place. The Imperium, even without Guilliman, is capable of sustaining planetary populations in the billions almost entirely with food and water imported from other star systems light years away. They are able to create a census of psychers throughout Imperial worlds who are brought to the capital by their thousands every single day to sustain the Emperor. Though it can be hard to get the Imperium moving in the first place, once it does, it can be hard to stop it. When the combined arms of different Imperial groups come together in a crusade, it can be terrifying for almost every other faction in the galaxy. In the Twice Dead novel series by Nate Crowley, we can see what an Imperial crusade looks like from the perspective of a reawakened Necron dynasty. The crusade in question is a great example of how effective the Imperial military is, and how terrifying it is too. The thing is, though, that none of that success and military prowess would be possible were it not for the power that is Imperial logistics. When Guilliman comes into the picture, the might of Imperial logistics is multiplied. The Indomitus Crusade is comprised of the disparate forces from plenty of different planetary systems and sectors of Imperial space, all organized as a cohesive unit for a particular purpose. None of the other things the Imperium is good at would really count for anything if it wasn't able to get its logistics right. Whatever about the industry required to build the god engines of the Adeptus Mechanicus, these machines wouldn't really matter if the Imperium wasn't able to transport them to its most pressing war zones. There's no point really in having all of this propaganda and repression if you can't disseminate it effectively throughout such a large amount of territory. Nations throughout our own history have also risen and fallen based on their ability to sustain themselves over a long period of time. One of the main reasons, possibly even the main reason, why the Imperium is so stable, aside from the Emperor of course, is that it's mastered the art of logistics over such a turbulent galaxy, with such unreliable means of interstellar travel. Without its mastery of logistics, there is just no Imperium. Well, there you have it, folks. Just a few of the things that I think the Imperium does well. If you want to learn about some of the things I think the Imperium does badly, there should be a link to that video coming up somewhere nearby. To those people that stayed to the end, I really hope you enjoyed this video. I know there are plenty of creators that have gone much more in depth on things like Imperial logistics, but I think it's definitely worth a mention here. If you did enjoy it, please make sure to like and subscribe, but also please do leave a comment and let me know what you think yourself. This is a new channel. I'm still getting my head around how to do all of this, so any support is much appreciated. Finally, just a quick thing at the end here. This video should be going out on the 17th of March, so for the day that's in it, Lá Féile Pádraig Sunnagiv. Happy St. Patrick's Day to all of you. I'll see you in the next one.